Thank you for listening to our Mystery Audiobook channel. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already to get updates on new audiobooks releasing every week. And now, for the feature presentation, Murder Beneath the Sphinx. Chapter 1. A Telegram from Cairo. Outside the windows of 221 Marston Square, the street lamp flickered uncertainly in the grey evening, while inside, Inspector Price of Scotland Yard nursed a glass of whisky and frowned over the Times. Price was a man of solid build, with a neatly trimmed moustache and eyes that missed little. Though his manner was quiet, there was a sharpness to him, an ever-watchful mind behind the calm demeanour. His rooms were modest and tidy, with only a few indulgences, a collection of rare tobacco tins on the mantelpiece, and a framed engraving of the pyramids above the fireplace. A small fire burned steadily, trying in vain to push away the biting chill of January. He had just folded the newspaper when there came a rap at the door, a brisk, impatient knock. Mrs. Rowley, the landlady, had long since retired for the evening, leaving Inspector Price to answer it himself. He opened the door to find a damp and breathless boy clutching a yellow telegram. "Urgent, sir," the lad said, "from the Yard." Price took the telegram, handed the boy a coin, and shut the door with a growing sense of unease. He slit open the envelope with his penknife and read, "Urgent. To Inspector Price, Scotland Yard, London. From British Consul, Cairo. Sir Reginald Ashcombe found dead at base of Sphinx, cause officially ruled accidental fall. Inconsistencies raised by expedition. Members, foul play suspected. You are requested by Foreign Office to investigate. Ticket arranged. Steamer sailing Southampton tomorrow. Consul Venables." Price read it twice, then folded it slowly. Sir Reginald Ashcombe. Now there was a name he hadn't heard in some time. The man was a legend in archaeological circles, a pioneer in Egyptology with knighthood and notoriety in equal measure. Though he had long enjoyed the favour of the Crown, there had been rumours of dubious dealings, black market artefacts, political meddling, and unsavoury connections with mercenary diggers. None of it ever proven, of course, but enough to raise an eyebrow among those who paid attention. And now he was dead. Price paced to the fireplace, staring up at the engraving of the pyramids. A curious coincidence. The image had been a gift from a former colleague, now posted in Cairo, and Price had often studied it with a quiet longing. Egypt, land of secrets, buried histories, and mysteries written in stone. He began to pack before the fire had burned low. The next morning at the Southampton docks, the air was sharp with salt as Price stood on the deck of the RMS Oceania, coat buttoned tight, fedora pulled low. The steamship was sleek and modern, bound for Alexandria with stops in Gibraltar and Malta. Below decks, Price already read over the dossier forwarded by the Foreign Office. Sir Reginald's expedition had been working near the Great Sphinx of Giza for nearly 6 months, investigating the site of what Ashcombe had claimed might be an undiscovered temple complex. Only days before his death, he had sent a cryptic telegram to the British Museum. "Discovery will change everything. Keep plans quiet. More soon." He never sent more. The official story claimed he had fallen from a temporary scaffolding erected near the forepaws of the Sphinx. Broken neck, instant death, a tragic accident. But now Price knew what experience had taught him many times over. Men like Ashcombe didn't simply fall, they were pushed, usually for something worth killing over. By the time the steamer cut through the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean, Inspector Price had memorized every name connected to the expedition. There were 5 individuals of note. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe, the archaeologist's much younger wife, described as refined and intelligent, but curiously absent from many of her husband's public ventures. Marcus Llewellyn, a bright young assistant from Oxford, rumoured to be ambitious and often at odds with Ashcombe's methods. Professor Amal Rashid, the Egyptian government-appointed liaison, a respected scholar and quiet nationalist known for his criticism of Western exploitation of Egyptian artifacts. Harriet Blythe, a journalist from the Illustrated London Courier, assigned to cover the expedition's progress, though why Ashcombe would allow a reporter into his most secretive dig was unclear. And lastly, Ahmed Youssef, the foreman of the local workers, a man with no formal education but with intimate knowledge of ancient tomb structures and desert terrain. Price closed the folder. 5 names. 5 possible reasons for Ashcombe to end up dead at the foot of the oldest riddle in history. He glanced out at the endless sea ahead, already tinged with the heat and dust of Egypt. Somewhere beyond that horizon, beneath the shadow of the great Sphinx, the truth waited. Chapter 2. Ashcombe's Circle. The Cairo sun was not kind to a man in wool. As Inspector Price stepped down from the carriage outside the British consulate, his collar already damp with sweat, he could not help but blink against the harsh brilliance that bounced off every limestone wall and sandstone. Egypt struck him at once as a land of contradictions, heat and shadow, grandeur and decay. The narrow streets buzzed with life, vendors hawking fruit and fabric, the cry of a distant muezzin rising from a nearby minaret, and the clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestones. A haze of fine desert dust hung in the air, softening the city's sharp outlines, but leaving a film over one's skin and lungs. The consulate, a pale villa framed by palms, was a quiet reprieve from the clamour outside. Price was shown into a high-ceilinged drawing-room where the air smelled faintly of camphor and polished wood. Waiting for him was Consul Gerald Venables, a stiff, balding man in an immaculate cream suit and pince-nez, whose manner was that of someone constantly reminded of his own importance. "Inspector Price," Venables said, shaking hands, "I trust your journey was tolerable." "I've had worse," Price replied dryly, removing his hat and setting his travel bag down. Venables gestured toward a tray. "Tea? Or something stronger?" "Tea, for now." They settled into leather chairs beneath a lazily turning fan. Venables poured the tea with practised precision. "The Foreign Office has taken a discreet but keen interest in this business," Venables began. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe was, shall we say, politically valuable." "Valuable to whom?" Price asked. Venables gave a thin smile. "To the Empire. His discoveries stirred public interest. Yes, but more than that, they strengthened Britain's foothold in Egypt's cultural landscape. If the locals believe we are preserving their history, well, it serves our purposes, doesn't it?" Price sipped his tea. "Tell me about the body," he said. "Found early morning 3 days ago. A local worker discovered him lying at the base of the Sphinx under the scaffolding. Neck broken. Death was likely instantaneous. Dr. Azmi, a reputable Cairo physician, signed off on the death certificate. But," he leaned forward, "there were inconsistencies." "What kind?" For one, Ashcombe had dismissed all workers the previous evening. The site was supposedly locked down. No one was to be there after dusk. And yet, he was. And someone with him, apparently. There were 2 sets of prints in the sand, one his, the other unidentified, and someone tried to brush them away. Price nodded slowly. "And his team?" "They're staying at the Hotel Giza Grand. All 5 returned to Cairo the morning after the death. Seemed shaken, but not devastated. You'll find them curious." Price finished his tea and stood. "I'll pay them a visit." The Giza Grand stood like a faded dowager amid palm fronds and colonial splendour. White stone, wide verandas, and tall shuttered windows gave it a stately air, but inside, its velvet chairs and Persian rugs spoke of grandeur past its prime. Price found the 5 members of the expedition lounging in a shaded corner of the veranda, beneath ceiling fans and the soft tinkle of piano music from indoors. A waiter hovered near, topping off glasses of iced lime water. They rose one by one as Price approached, introducing themselves politely, warily. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe was the first to speak. Tall, elegantly dressed in ivory muslin with a wide-brimmed hat, she seemed the picture of Victorian grace. Yet her grey-blue eyes held none of the softness expected of a widow. They were sharp, measuring. "Inspector Price," she said, extending a gloved hand. "So the Crown has sent its finest to dig through our dust and grief." Price inclined his head. "I offer my condolences, Lady Evelyn." She offered a weak smile. "They're appreciated, though I'm not entirely convinced I need them." Beside her stood Marcus Llewellyn, barely 30, in a rumpled linen suit and horn-rimmed spectacles, dark hair slicked back. He looked like a man who would rather be buried in maps than making polite conversation. "I told the consulate it wasn't an accident," he said bluntly. "Sir Reginald was no fool. He didn't climb scaffolds in the dark for fun." "And what would he have been doing there?" Price asked. Llewellyn hesitated. "That's the question, isn't it?" Next was Professor Amal Rashid, dressed impeccably in a Western-style suit, though a deep green scarf added a touch of Egyptian tradition. His gaze was calm, unreadable. "Inspector," he said with a slight bow, "welcome to Egypt. I hope your time here will be enlightening." "Thank you, Professor. You were the liaison for the excavation." "I was. My duties were scholarly, but also political. I reported regularly to the Antiquities Service." "And your relationship with Sir Reginald?" Rashid offered a dry smile. "Professional, polite, rarely warm." To Price's right, Harriet Blythe was already scribbling notes in a small leather notebook. She was short, wiry, with keen grey eyes and a mop of chestnut curls under a linen cap. "Are you taking statements or staging your own investigation?" she asked brightly. "Because if it's the latter, I'd advise you to start at the Sphinx. The ground tells its own story." "You've been there since the accident?" Price asked. "I went the morning after," she said. "Most of the sand had been disturbed by then, but there were things still left to see, scrape marks near the stones, for instance." "What sort of scrape marks?" She shrugged. Could have been dragging, could have been tools, or both. Lastly, Ahmed Youssef, the Egyptian foreman, stood apart from the group. Broad-shouldered, with sun-creased skin and watchful eyes, he said little. When Price approached, the man simply bowed. "I loved working for Sir Reginald," Ahmed said softly, "but he had many enemies, some near, some far, some in plain sight." The words struck Price as more than metaphor. Later. That night, in his hotel room, Price sat by the window overlooking the city. A phonograph played faint Arabic music in the distance, and the scent of jasmine drifted on the air. He reviewed his notes by lamplight. 1 man dead. 5 people close enough to kill him. Lady Evelyn had the least emotion of the group. Cool, composed, distant. Was it grief or guilt? Llewellyn showed flashes of resentment. Ashcombe had kept his discoveries close. Jealousy could breed dark thoughts. Rashid was polite to a fault, but nationalism could be a powerful motive. Harriet Blythe's curiosity was razor-sharp. She knew more than she let on. And Ahmed had warned him outright. Enemies in plain sight. Price closed his notebook. He would visit the dig site first thing in the morning. Chapter 3. Sand and Secrets. Inspector Price adjusted his collar and stepped out of the shaded motor car. The Giza Plateau rose around him, solemn and timeless. The 3 pyramids loomed like slumbering titans, but his gaze was drawn to their guardian, the colossal Sphinx, half lion, half man, its chipped face and weary eyes staring eastward as it had for millennia. The excavation site buzzed with cautious activity. A few local workers moved about under the direction of a British overseer, their movements subdued, as though the death of Sir Reginald Ashcombe had dampened not just spirits, but ambition. Wooden scaffolding wrapped partially around the statue's paws, with rope ladders and makeshift platforms suspended like spiderwebs. Tarpaulin-covered crates and discarded brushes lay beside a small canvas tent. Price was greeted by Dr. Sameh Azmi, the Cairo physician who had signed the death certificate. A lean man in his 60s with sun-spotted skin and immaculate posture, he walked with a quiet dignity and offered Price a polite handshake. "I understand you had questions about Sir Reginald's death," Azmi said, leading him toward the spot where the body had been found. "Questions, yes," Price replied, scanning the ground. "Tell me, Doctor, you declared it an accidental fall, but privately you weren't so sure." Azmi pursed his lips. It was not a typical fall. His injuries, fractured cervical vertebrae, blunt trauma to the back of the skull, and a shattered wrist, suggested he did not fall naturally, or not from the height claimed. "What do you mean?" "The scaffold is only 10 feet high. A fall from that height could break a bone, yes, but to kill instantly, it would require either a precise landing or an external force." "Like being pushed?" Azmi nodded. Price crouched beside the scaffold's base. The sand had shifted since the day of death, but faint impressions lingered. He could just make out the faded outline of a boot print, larger than most locals, and beside it a partial smear. "Was this area disturbed before your arrival?" Price asked. Azmi hesitated. "The body was found at dawn. Several workers gathered before anyone from the government could arrive. It's likely the scene was unintentionally compromised." Price stood and removed a notebook from his coat. "Was anything found on Sir Reginald's person?" "A compass, a battered field journal, and a small gold amulet, shaped like a scarab." "Where are they now?" "Held by the Ministry of Antiquities. The British consulate has made a formal request to release the journal to your custody. It should arrive tomorrow." Price looked around. The others from the team had not come today. He had asked them to stay away, to keep the scene undisturbed. Except someone had come. Near the back of the Sphinx's massive hindquarters, Price noticed a thin trail of footprints leading behind a stone outcropping. The wind hadn't reached this corner, and the tracks were fresh. Following them cautiously, he rounded the rock and found Harriet Blythe, crouched with her back to him, sketchbook open, pencils scratching furiously. "I thought I told you to stay away," Price said. She started but didn't look guilty. "And miss all this," she said, standing up. "Don't worry, I haven't touched anything, just observing, from a distance." Price stepped beside her and looked down at her sketchbook. It was startlingly accurate, a detailed rendering of the excavation layout, the scaffold, and even the position where Ashcombe's body had been found. "You're a quick study," he remarked. "Comes with the job," she said, dusting off her skirt. "I used to do courtroom illustrations before they banned them. Faces, gestures, details, they stick with me. That's why Ashcombe hated me." Did he now? He didn't like being watched. Most people don't when they have something to hide. "Did you think he was hiding something?" She gave him a sidelong glance. "Of course. But then again, I think most people are. Don't you?" Price smiled faintly. "Only when they start lying." They stood in silence for a moment, the great paws of the Sphinx casting long shadows over the site. "Did you know about the telegram Ashcombe sent to the British Museum?" he asked suddenly. "The one about a discovery that would change everything?" she replied. "I heard whispers. He was paranoid about it, locked his tent every night, wouldn't let even Llewellyn near the new chamber." "So there was a chamber?" She nodded. I saw it from a distance, half excavated, looked like the top of an entrance, but after Ashcombe died, the workers sealed it up and left it untouched. Why? Out of respect or fear, depends on who you ask. Price crouched again and swept some sand from a small depression in the rock beside the Sphinx's paw. A tiny fragment glinted in the light, a sliver of blue-green faience, the kind used in ancient Egyptian jewellery. He wrapped it in a handkerchief and slipped it into his pocket. Later that day, back at the Giza Grand, Inspector Price summoned Marcus Llewellyn for a private word. The young assistant arrived looking slightly sunburned and sleep-deprived. He sat stiffly in the rattan chair, his knuckles pale against the handle of his satchel. "You worked with Sir Reginald longer than anyone else," Price began. "What can you tell me about his state of mind in the days leading up to his death?" Llewellyn hesitated, then sighed. He was obsessed, that's the word for it. Obsessive, paranoid. He believed he was on the verge of something revolutionary, something that would make Carter's tomb look like a coin purse. A new tomb? Yes, hidden chambers beneath the Sphinx. There are old legends, Herodotus even hinted at them, but no one ever found proof, until now, according to him. Did anyone else believe him? Not really. Professor Rashid was sceptical. Lady Evelyn had stopped showing any interest in the excavation altogether. And He stopped. "You what?" "I was envious. He wouldn't share the findings, kept me in the dark, after everything I'd done for him. I suppose I resented it." Price studied the man's face. Resentment can be dangerous. Llewellyn met his eyes. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm observing, that's all." There was a knock at the door. A bellboy handed Price a sealed envelope, an official dispatch from the Ministry of Antiquities. Inside was Sir Reginald Ashcombe's recovered field journal. Price opened it slowly. The last page was stained with a thin smudge of red and bore only one sentence, hastily scrawled in pencil. "The jackal has followed us to the tomb." He stared at the page. Something told him this was not about an animal. This was about someone in Ashcombe's inner circle. Chapter 4. The Widow's Revelation. The late afternoon sun in Cairo was a slow furnace, turning the city's sandstone walls into smouldering embers and sending long amber shadows across the floor of Inspector Price's suite. He sat at the writing desk, the journal of Sir Reginald Ashcombe open before him, fingers tracing the final cryptic line. "The jackal has followed us to the tomb." What had Ashcombe meant? In Egyptian mythology, the jackal was sacred, Anubis, god of the dead and protector of tombs. But in modern metaphor, a jackal was a scavenger, a thief, a traitor. Price closed the journal gently. The symbolism was clear enough, but the identity of Ashcombe's jackal remained frustratingly out of reach. A sharp knock broke the silence. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably in a deep blue walking gown, her hat and gloves as elegant as ever. But her face, normally a mask of graceful detachment, seemed drawn and fatigued. "I was told you wished to speak with me," she said coolly. Price gestured toward the shaded corner of the room where two armchairs flanked a small tea table. "I did. Thank you for coming." She settled in without ceremony, removing her gloves with the slow grace of a woman used to waiting for others to speak second. But this time, Price began bluntly. "Lady Evelyn, forgive my directness, but I need to understand the nature of your relationship with your late husband." Her eyes flicked up sharply. "We were married, Inspector. That should suffice." "It doesn't," he said evenly, "because everything I've seen and heard so far suggests you weren't particularly close. You travelled with him, yes, but you weren't at the site on the night of his death. You were already in Cairo." She tilted her head slightly. "It's not unusual for wives to remain in town during field work." Not when the dig is considered a historic discovery, and not when your husband had grown increasingly secretive." For the first time, her mask cracked. A thin, brittle smile touched her lips. "Ah, so you've begun to see it?" "See what?" She leaned forward, voice low. "That my husband was brilliant, yes, but also cruel, obsessive, and entirely faithless. He lied to me, to everyone. He lied even when there was nothing to gain, just for the pleasure of holding secrets others could not access. You think I grieve? I grieved for him 2 years ago. The man who died beneath that statue. He was no longer someone I recognized." Price observed her in silence. Her words weren't spoken with rage or bitterness. They were uttered with the flat, resigned cadence of truth. "So why stay with him?" he asked. "I once believed he loved me, when I was 22 and foolish. He was already famous then, charming, magnetic, filled with stories of lost kings and buried treasure. I believed I was the queen beside him. But slowly that changed. The stories dried up. The passion turned inward, toward the tombs. I was left with a stranger." "Did he ever speak of the tomb beneath the Sphinx?" She hesitated. "Once," she said, "after one of his nightmares. He woke drenched in sweat, muttering about shadows in the stone. I tried to calm him, but he pushed me away. He told me the tomb would make or destroy him, that it would answer every question and raise more dangerous ones." "What kind of dangerous questions?" "He never said, but he wrote letters, at night, often by candlelight while I pretended to sleep. He kept them in a small leather folder, locked. He called it his final archive. I never saw what was inside." "Do you know where this folder is now?" She shook her head. "Gone. Either it was taken after his death, or someone knew to take it before." Price considered her. Her answers were not rehearsed. And more than that, she seemed not to be hiding anything, but offering him a chance to look beneath her surface. "Do you know of anyone who might have wanted your husband dead?" She paused, then reached into her reticule and withdrew a small envelope. "I found this in our suite the night before we left for Cairo," she said quietly. "Slipped under the door." Price took it and opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded scrap of paper with 4 words scrawled in Arabic and a shaky English translation underneath. "Leave before the jackal feeds." He stared at the words. The same metaphor Ashcombe had used in his journal. The jackal again. "You didn't tell anyone about this?" She shook her head. "Reginald would have dismissed it as a prank. But I know better. Egyptians use symbols like this when they feel they aren't being heard. Someone was trying to warn me or frighten me." Price looked down at the message. The handwriting was rough, uneven. A local, a worker, someone with enough English to translate, but not enough fluency to write fluidly. He folded it slowly. "Why show this to me now?" "Because I'm tired of silence, and because you're the first person who seems to be asking the right questions." There was a quiet knock. A porter appeared at the door. "Inspector, a message from the consulate." Price took the envelope and opened it. It contained a single line, hastily typed. "Parcel recovered from Ashcombe's tent during final clearance. Delivered to hotel per your request." He excused himself and returned moments later with a plain wooden box sealed with wax and stamped with the mark of the Antiquities Office. He opened it carefully. Inside was a leather folder, aged and scuffed. The final archive. Lady Evelyn's breath caught. He opened it and found a stack of letters, written in Ashcombe's careful script. But more shocking than their contents was the addressee. Each letter began the same. To Harriet, "If anything happens to me." Price looked up sharply. Harriet Blythe, the journalist, the woman who had no official reason to be on the dig at all, the woman with the sketchbook. the woman Ashcombe had written to, in secrecy and repeatedly. Price rose. "Thank you, Lady Evelyn. You've been more helpful than you know." As he stepped into the hallway, gripping the folder tightly, a single question echoed through his thoughts like the voice of the Sphinx itself. Why would a man like Sir Reginald Ashcombe trust a stranger with his life's secrets unless she wasn't a stranger at all? Chapter 5. The Curse That Wasn't. Inspector Price stepped out of the Giza Grand Hotel and paused for a moment on the stone steps, thinking about the envelope in his breast pocket. Inside were the first of Sir Reginald Ashcombe's private letters, written not to colleagues nor to his wife, but to Harriet Blythe, the young journalist. The tone was strikingly personal, intimate even. But most telling was what he had written in the final letter. "There are forces that would see this tomb buried again, not for superstition, but for fear of truth. I believe someone among us is trying to stop me. If I do not survive this, Harriet, it will not be a god that strikes me down, it will be a man, or a woman." By mid-morning, Price stood once more beneath the shadow of the great Sphinx, the air thick with the scent of dust and diesel oil. The site had fallen eerily quiet. Workers huddled in small groups, speaking in low tones. A sense of fear hung over the excavation like a heavy veil. Dr. Sameh Azmi met him with grim news. "There's been another death," the physician said, leading Price toward the back of the site. "One of the workers, Rashad, a good man, loyal, quiet." "What happened?" Price asked. "Poisoning," Azmi said grimly. "His tent mates found him before dawn, foaming at the mouth, rigid hands. We could do nothing." "Accidental?" Azmi hesitated. "Hardly. Someone gave him something. In his tea, perhaps. He hadn't eaten since the previous evening." Price stopped walking. "Do you believe this has anything to do with Sir Reginald's death?" Azmi nodded slowly. Rashad was the first man to see the new chamber. He was one of 3 labourers chosen to break the final layer of stone. And the other 2? Dismissed quietly the day after Ashcombe's death, sent back to their villages with extra pay. Price narrowed his eyes. Who dismissed them? Azmi hesitated. "The order came through Ahmed Youssef." The foreman, quiet, watchful. A man Price had pegged as intelligent and deeply loyal to the old land. Price excused himself and crossed the camp until he found Ahmed, seated in the shadow of a crumbling limestone block, carving a small wooden scarab with a short blade. "Ahmed," Price said, crouching beside him, "I need you to be honest with me." Ahmed looked up. "I have been, Inspector." "You dismissed the 2 workers who entered the tomb with Rashad." "I did." "Why?" Ahmed's hands stilled. "Because they were afraid," he said slowly. "They said there was something wrong inside, that when the stone cracked open, the air was thick, too thick, and there was something, not a presence, but a feeling." "A feeling?" "They believed it was cursed, that we had disturbed something sacred. I told them to go, for their own peace." "Did you believe it too?" Ahmed hesitated a long time before answering. "No," he said finally, "but I believe someone wanted us to believe it." "Who?" Ahmed looked toward the Sphinx, as though expecting it to whisper the answer. "I don't know, but curses are useful, Inspector. They make men run before they ask questions." Price stared at him. "And Rashad?" Ahmed's face darkened. "He did not run. He spoke too much. He said he had seen something, just before the stone door fell. A flash of light, a shadow moving deeper into the chamber, as though someone had already been inside." "You think someone accessed the tomb before it was officially opened?" Price asked. Ahmed nodded. "Yes, someone with knowledge and fear." Later that afternoon, back at the hotel, Price summoned Harriet Blythe to his suite. She arrived briskly, her notebook in hand, her expression a careful mix of curiosity and irritation. "You summoned me like a suspect," she said lightly, taking a seat. "You are one," Price said, setting the leather folder, Ashcombe's archive, on the table between them. Her eyes flicked toward it. "So, you found it. You know what it is?" "I do." "You didn't tell me. You didn't ask." Price opened the folder and slid one of the letters across the table. Harriet hesitated only a second before reading. "Harriet, if anything happens to me, they will say it was an accident, but you'll know better." She looked up. Her mask of sarcasm had fallen away. "How close were you to him?" Price asked. "I wasn't his mistress, if that's what you're implying," she said sharply. "But he trusted you, enough to confide things he didn't tell his wife or his assistant." She hesitated. "Yes, because I didn't want anything from him. Not funding, not glory. I only wanted the truth." "Why were you on the dig at all? A site like this doesn't typically allow journalists." She gave a small, bitter smile. "Because I knew something." "My mother," she said quietly, "was Reginald's lover. Many years ago, before he was married, she was a translator, fluent in hieroglyphs and Coptic. She helped him with his earliest papers. Then he abandoned her, left her name off the articles, took all the credit. She died in poverty while he became Sir Reginald." "I'm sorry," Price said, meaning it. "I came here because I wanted to see if he was the man she said he was, or something worse." "And what did you find?" She looked away. "Something worse." "Did you kill him?" She met his eyes evenly. "No." "But someone did," she added. "Someone who knew exactly what he was about to find and wanted it buried again." She pulled a sheet from her notebook and handed it over. It was a rubbing of a carving, one found, she claimed, just inside the tomb entrance before it was sealed again. It depicted a man being weighed on a scale beside a jackal-headed figure. But instead of the usual feather of Mayat, which was the symbol of truth, the scale was tipped by a British coin. Price stared at it. A modern coin, in an ancient carving? "Impossible," he whispered. "Unless someone altered it," Harriet said, "which means someone was in the tomb, recently, before it was opened, someone who left a message, a warning or a threat." A knock at the door interrupted them. A telegram delivered by a hotel attendant. Price opened it and read quickly. "To Inspector Price. From British Museum, London." Ashcombe's final telegram, received 6 hours before death, mentioned new chamber and intention to inform authorities of unauthorized activity on site. Quoted, "Will name the man in question shortly. H." "H," Price whispered, his mind racing. "Harriet?" No, he doubted it. He turned to her. "Did Ashcombe ever mention who he suspected?" "No," she said. "He just said he'd been followed, that someone wanted to find the tomb before him, that this person would rather kill than be exposed." Price stood. One man dead, another poisoned, whispers of curses. But it wasn't ancient wrath. It was human, and the key to it all was buried beneath centuries of stone. Chapter 6. Return to England. The Nile shimmered under the late afternoon sun like a river of gold. From his hotel balcony, Inspector Price could see the feluccas sailing lazily along the water, their white sails crisp against the indigo sky. The air was thick with the scent of cardamom and the distant call to prayer from a minaret rising above the rooftops. But Price's thoughts were far from the beauty of Cairo. He stood still, the telegram from the British Museum clenched in his hand. "Will name the man in question shortly. 8 late." That final line in Ashcombe's last message haunted him. H. The initial hung like a shadow over every face in the case. Harriet, Hassan, the missing Hassan Effendi, Professor Amal Rashid, who once published under the pseudonym Haroun, and even Her Majesty's office for that matter. But one other possibility had begun to take root in Price's mind. It wasn't just about who had killed Sir Reginald, it was about why. And that answer might be thousands of miles away, buried not in sand, but in glass and stone, in the halls of the British Museum. Price took the steamer back to England. The fog welcomed him like an old acquaintance. It clung to the cobblestones of Southampton as the steamer docked, then thickened as the train cut through the countryside toward London. By the time Price stepped off at Victoria Station, the air was full of drizzle and smoke. He was back in the city of gas lamps and whispers. His first stop was Scotland Yard. There, a letter awaited him, marked Private. It was from Sir Archibald Stroud, chairman of the British Museum Trustees, requesting a meeting at his office that very afternoon. The tone was friendly, too friendly. The museum stood austere and imposing, its Greco-Roman facade no more inviting than a mausoleum. Inside, the smell of parchment, dust, and aged leather filled the air. Price was led through galleries of forgotten empires and into the museum's administrative wing, where Sir Archibald waited in a room lined with teak shelves and glass display cases. Stroud rose to greet him, a tall man with silver hair and a politician's handshake, firm, warm, but calculated. "Inspector Price, a pleasure. I trust your journey from Egypt was enlightening." Price accepted the seat across from him. It was more revealing than expected. "I imagine so. The news of Ashcombe's death reached us swiftly. Tragic. The man was eccentric, yes, but a visionary." "A visionary with enemies," Price said evenly. Stroud gave a soft chuckle. "As are all great men, Inspector. But surely you don't believe his death was anything more than a desert misstep." Price met his gaze. "I believe someone had something to lose if Ashcombe lived to share what he discovered." Stroud's smile remained, but his eyes hardened slightly. "And what did he discover exactly?" "You tell me," Price said. "He was preparing to send his findings here. He wrote that he'd uncovered something that would change everything. Then, hours later, he was dead, and someone had been inside the chamber before him." Stroud didn't blink. "Inspector, the museum receives hundreds of such claims a year. Hidden temples, secret cartouches, revolutionary tombs. 99% are either exaggerations or fantasies. The desert plays tricks on brilliant minds." Price reached into his coat and withdrew the rubbing of the carving Harriet had given him, the one depicting the British coin on the scales of Mayat. Stroud stared at it, just for a second, but Price saw the flicker of recognition. "You know what this is," Price said quietly. "I know it's a forgery," Stroud said smoothly. "No real Egyptian artisan would include modern currency in a sacred scene. This was clearly planted, perhaps by a nationalist trying to make a statement, or an ambitious reporter." "Like Harriet Blythe?" "Among others." "And what about Professor Rashid? You were in correspondence with him about the dig, were you not?" Stroud's lips tightened. "We consulted Rashid years ago, a talented man, but his politics are inconvenient. Too Egyptian, too loud." Price let that hang for a moment. What if Ashcombe discovered something that undermined the museum's holdings? A tomb that proves many artifacts in your displays were removed from Egypt illegally. What if he meant to go public? Stroud rose slowly, walking to the window. Rain misted against the glass. If he had, Stroud said without turning, then someone would certainly have had reason to stop him. That evening, back in his rooms in Marston Square, Price lit a fire and poured himself a modest glass of brandy. He set Harriet's sketch, Ashcombe's letters, and the ministry telegram in a neat row on the table. The pattern was beginning to form. Ashcombe had uncovered a sealed tomb, one which contained evidence of modern tampering and political implication. He had intended to send that evidence to the British Museum, perhaps even the press. Someone had gotten there first, left behind a warning, possibly a message, in the form of altered hieroglyphics. Then came Ashcombe's death, followed by the murder of a local worker who had seen too much. And now, back in England, the museum's silence. A silence loud enough to be deliberate. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a small parcel, hand-delivered, without sender's name. Inside was a single item, an unmarked envelope, its only content a torn fragment of parchment. A single phrase in neat hieroglyphs, and beneath it a line of translation in familiar handwriting. The tomb was never lost, only hidden. R.A. Reginald Ashcombe. And on the back of the parchment, a smudged fingerprint. Recent. Whoever had sent this had touched it. Whoever had taken Ashcombe's secrets was now watching. Inspector Price sat back, the brandy untouched. The true killer wasn't just hiding behind ancient walls or political institutions. The killer was playing a far more dangerous game. And someone else was pulling the strings. It was time to go back to Egypt. Chapter 7. The Twist in the Sand. The sun over Cairo blazed down upon the Giza Plateau, where the sand shimmered and the stones breathed heat. Inspector Price had left England, and now he stood once more before the weathered face of the great Sphinx. This time he wasn't alone. At his side stood Harriet Blythe, her expression unreadable behind the brim of her linen hat. She clutched a leather satchel that held everything: Ashcombe's journal, the rubbing of the altered carving, and the final letter she had received from him before his death. Also present was Professor Amal Rashid, summoned at Price's request. The Egyptian scholar appeared calm, but his hands were clasped tightly behind his back, and his eyes remained fixed on the sealed mouth of the tomb. And finally, Ahmed Youssef, the foreman, stood near the workers, arms crossed, silent and watchful. A scaffold had been reassembled. The stone door at the base of the Sphinx, previously resealed, had been carefully pried open once more. The opening looked like the throat of some great buried beast. Price took a lantern from one of the workers and turned to the group. "We go in together," he said. "No secrets, no separations." They descended into the darkness. Inside the hidden chamber, the air was cool and dry. Dust danced in the shafts of lantern light. They moved cautiously down a stone corridor that sloped beneath the Sphinx's paws. Ancient symbols lined the walls, some genuine, others modern additions that Price now recognized as deliberate alterations. They reached the burial chamber. The ceiling soared higher than expected, its centre marked by a crumbling statue of Anubis. At its base was the stone platform, now empty, where Ashcombe had been working before his death. But what drew everyone's eyes was the second chamber, newly uncovered. Its entrance had been partially obscured by debris and stone blocks. Harriet stepped forward, breath catching. "This is where he said the truth would be found," she whispered. Price nodded to Ahmed, who motioned to the workers. With great care the entry was cleared. The room beyond was smaller, but more startling. On one wall, a relief carving that mirrored the rubbing Harriet had made, a scale, Anubis on one side, a man on the other. But in this version, the weights were British coins, unmistakable even in stone. Another panel depicted foreign men carrying artifacts into ships, while Egyptians knelt in chains. Rashid stared at the walls, his expression unreadable. "This," he said softly, "is a message left not by the ancients, but by someone who loved them." "Or someone who wanted to use them," Price replied. At the far end of the chamber stood a stone chest. Inside it, meticulously preserved, were scroll fragments marked with the cartouche of an undocumented pharaoh, and among them, tucked within linen wrappings, lay a letter written in Ashcombe's hand. Price read it aloud. "To those who come after, know that this tomb contains evidence of betrayal, the relics stolen, sold, falsified, the lies told to maintain power. I was part of it. I profited from it. But I will not die with it on my conscience. I name the one who seeks to silence this truth. Amal Rashid." Price turned slowly. The professor's face had not changed. No denial, no protest. "You knew he would write it," Price said. "That's why you followed him." Rashid inclined his head. "I did not kill him. I never laid a hand on him." "But you knew someone would," Harriet said. "I merely ensured that Ashcombe would not survive long enough to undo the thefts he enabled for decades. He was ready to turn his back on the very empire he had helped empower, a hypocrite in the final act." "So you let it happen?" Price asked. Rashid stepped toward the wall, resting a hand on the carving. "Do you know how many of our ancestors' remains lie beneath the floors of British galleries? How many scrolls torn? How many tombs empty to decorate drawing rooms in London?" "I understand your anger," Price said, "but you turned it into murder." "Number I did not kill him," Rashid repeated, his voice calm, "but I knew someone else would." Price stared. "Who?" The answer came from behind them. "I did." Everyone turned. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe stood in the doorway, pistol in hand. Her hair was tucked under a scarf, her expression set. Harriet gasped. "You followed us?" "Yes," Evelyn said, "because I knew this day would come, and because I couldn't let him become a martyr." She stepped further into the chamber, weapons steady. "My husband ruined lives. He stole from the people who welcomed him. He betrayed my trust, betrayed my family's name. And when he told me he intended to reveal everything, not out of guilt, but for glory, I knew what I had to do." "You pushed him from the scaffold," Price said quietly. "I waited until he climbed up alone. I knew his habits. I confronted him. He begged me to let him finish his letter. I did. Then I gave him a choice. He said it was too late." She gave a bitter laugh. "So I made it final." "And the worker?" Price asked. "Rashad?" She hesitated. "Number, that wasn't me." All eyes turned back to Rashid. "I warned Rashad not to speak," the professor said, "but he believed the truth would protect him. I gave him laudanum laced with belladonna. He passed peacefully." Harriet's eyes blazed. "Peacefully? You murdered a man who thought he was helping your cause." "And he did," Rashid said coldly. "He kept the tomb sealed long enough for me to alter the walls, to craft the message." "But why send the parchment fragment to London?" Price asked. "I didn't," Rashid said. "That wasn't me." Price turned to Harriet. She said nothing, but her eyes said everything. "You sent it," he said. "You wanted me to return. You knew only the British government could protect this site once the truth came out." She nodded. "I wanted you to finish what Ashcombe couldn't." The aftermath at the British consulate in Cairo. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe was taken into custody quietly. She offered no resistance. When asked by the consulate for a statement, she gave only 5 words. "Let the sand cover him." Professor Rashid disappeared before a warrant could be issued. It was believed he fled into Upper Egypt, where nationalist sentiment offered him shelter. The tomb was sealed, this time not to be looted, but preserved. A joint Anglo-Egyptian team was formed to protect and study the site. Inspector Price returned to London. Not all crimes, he now understood, were committed in darkness. Some were written in daylight, in ink and silence, signed by power. Epilogue, Marston Square, London. Price sat at his desk, a fresh cup of tea steaming beside him, and read the final article Harriet Blythe had sent him from Cairo. It appeared in the Illustrated London Courier beneath a bold headline, "The Sins of the Sand, Ashcomb's Final Discovery." The article laid out the truth in cautious but damning detail about the falsified tombs, the recarved artifacts, the quiet complicity of those who looked the other way. At the bottom, beneath her byline, she had written a simple dedication, "For the ones who kept digging." Price folded the newspaper and leaned back. Sometimes, he thought, justice didn't come with a noose or a trial. Sometimes it came with the truth and the courage to let it breathe.